All right. It's the 6 o'clock hour. I do want to say hello. My name is Brooke Green. I am a senior transportation planner with ACHD. I'm also the project manager for this project. I want to thank all of you guys for attending. Before I jump into the presentation itself, I do just want to kind of lay some ground rules as well as orient you to the way in which tonight's open house will take place. So just to check in, we'll make sure that you guys are at the right public hearing. This is for Taft Street between Sycamore and 36. The whole point of this presentation and this project is to really look to the street to see if we can find opportunities to do bike and pedestrian enhancements. So this evening's presentation, I'm going to walk you through what's called a story map. The story map is actually already online. So if you've taken the time to go to our website and find the project, you may have already visited it, and that's perfectly fine. But today I'm going to walk us through a little bit slower, and I'm going to take us through all three alternatives. In addition to that, I do want to highlight some of our teammates that we have with us who are, if questions arise, will be available to answer questions. So we have our communications team, both Avery and Christy from ACHD, Kendall from our engineering department. I'm not sure if I see somebody yet from the city of Boise, but I do want to reiterate that we do have the city of Boise as part of our project team. We've got Kristen from Parametrics, who is also our project manager on this as our consultant. Before we head into the story map, however, let's talk about the platform we're using this evening. All of you were muted. At the end of the presentation, should you have any questions, we'll certainly have an opportunity to unmute you. So we'll unmute you, but then you have to unmute yourself. And I'll go through these directions once again. However, when we get to that point of the presentation, if you do have a question you'd like to ask verbally, we do ask that you follow a couple ground rules. Be respectful. While your opinion is incredibly important, it might differ from someone else. And so if your question does arise, we do just ask that you be respectful of other people who are asking questions too. There won't be a time where you'll be able to communicate back and forth with one another, however. However, as we get through this presentation, I do want to highlight that there's other ways in which you can participate. So looking at the platform itself at the top corner, you'll see the people, the chat, reactions, Q&A, polls, and more. In this section right here is where we're going to ask you to engage with us. Ideally, we want you to write us questions either through Q&A. So the Q&A is where you're going to ask us questions. My teammates behind the scenes are going to actually go through one by one and answer those as I'm going through the presentation. So again, your Q&A, click on it. Should pull up. You'll see my little puppy there. It'll say ask a question, and that's when you're going to fill it in. And then somebody else on my team will respond. In addition to that, I do want to highlight there's a poll section. So through the presentation this evening, after each alternative, I'm going to ask a series of questions. I do want to reiterate that these questions are also online on the story map. And so if you can't answer them here for whatever reason, you can certainly go back to answer them online. If you're not showing the polls, if they're not popping up, it's likely that you actually have a pop-up blocker on your computer, and therefore it's not allowing those polls to populate. Again, if you want to participate, you can go online to our link, and we'll have that available so you guys can go there if you can't do the polls here. But the polls will be listed and the answers will come up right here on the right-hand side. The chat box, in addition to that, is where you're also going to see the polls come up too. We're not using the chat box. We want to encourage you guys to use the Q&A to ask us questions because then we can answer to them. All right, with that being said, I'm going to jump into the presentation itself. I'm committed to keeping this to 1 hour. Earlier's presentation actually was short. It was, we ended in about 40 minutes, so there's that likelihood this too could also be a pretty short presentation. I do also want to say in our first presentation, we weren't able to unmute folks for questions, and so I encourage them to email me. In this case, we figured out a means in which to unmute you, so you can ask a verbal question if that should arise, or if you didn't get that answer in the Q&A segment. So with that being said, I'm going to jump over to the story map. And as I highlighted this story map, make sure I actually share my screen. This story map should look familiar. It is what is on our website under projects. I do want to, again, just reiterate, It's thrilling to be here this evening. We are looking at Taft Street. I'm going to talk about how we got here. And really what it is our projects are defined, put forward by community members, by school districts, by the city. And that's the case with Taft Street. So as we were out there evaluating Taft Street, and we have had several surveys and conversations with the neighborhood, it became apparent that a lot of people felt that Taft was unsafe because it didn't have bike and pedestrian facilities. In addition to that, a lot of folks had highlighted that there were some concerns whether or not speeding was taking place. And so I will highlight and I will say Taft Street has a personality of itself. And before we jump into its existing conditions, I do want to talk about how it is that we're going to explore these alternatives and what we're going to do and put forward, but also talk about the schedule, and all of that's going to happen tonight. But before I jump into that, I have a question in which to ask you, and this is kind of your test to see if our polling does work. So before we start and we head into the alternatives themselves, please answer this question that should be populating right now. And the first question is, how do you primarily use Taft Street between Sycamore and 36th? You can choose multiple options. So do you live nearby, own a business, commute, shopping, errands? Want you guys to go ahead and click on here. One, it's a test to make sure that we're actually doing the poll. So take that moment, all the participants, if you could fill that out real quick. And again, you guys should be able to see it here on the right-hand side. So there it goes. All right, if you want to see this, click on chat. It should show up on the right-hand side. And right now we've got 33% of you say you live nearby, shopping, errands, commute from work, pardon me, recreation and other. So our front runner being that you live nearby. With that being said, I've got a second question for you. So as that one wraps up, what kind of transportation do you typically use on Taft Street? That should be a new poll that would populate here in just a moment. And again, you can choose multiple. So is it car, truck, bike, motorcycle, bike, walking, other? Just go ahead and click that over. And again, the poll results will show up underneath the chat. Click on the chat. It'll open up on your right-hand side. So 35% of you say that you guys drive down this, 25% bike, 37% walking. Fabulous. Okay, so that was actually a test. That was just a test to see if we can make sure that the polling's working well, but also it gives us a highlight of who our audience is this evening and how it is that you currently use the streets. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and toggle back over to the story map, and we're going to jump into the presentation itself. So again, this should look very familiar to you. I do want to highlight before we get into the alternatives what we heard in our initial outreach. So we did an initial outreach in December where we went and sent out a survey, asked you guys to participate. And one of the things I want to highlight here is what we just heard from you, right? How it is that you use the street. Well, in this case, 267 live nearby, 198 shop and errand, 134 recreate. And what it does is it just highlights like what is the uses along this corridor. It is incredibly important while we recognize the uses, but it's also incredibly important that we also hear from those who reside on the street. So for those who live nearby, chances are they probably live either on Taft themselves or maybe on Sycamore on 36th Street. We want to hear from you in particular. But one of the things that I do want to draw your attention to is what's highlighted down here at the bottom. We asked of the participants, does Taft Street need improvements? And 270 of you overwhelmingly said yes. So that was kind of the driving force is, well, we're clearly onto something. We do need to get out here and take a little look into Taft and what type of improvements. Where 17 of you did say no, that you perfectly like it the way it is now. So moving on to what the other results were is, what would a perfect Taft Street look like? And that's kind of where we're at tonight is, is it continuous sidewalks? Is it bike lanes, traffic calming? Those are all three things that were highlighted in that survey. And all three of those things in each alternative that we're putting forward, we're confident enough the alternative in itself is a good solution to being able to provide for folks walking, biking, in addition, slowing down vehicles. So with that being said, I want to jump into the alternatives. But before we do that, I want to give you a lay of the land. As I mentioned, Taft Street has a personality of itself. It's currently a 2-lane roadway where you've got 25 mile per hour speeds. However, the pavement width throughout the corridor, as you're probably well aware, is very different. So whereas on the west side, you have approximately 22 feet worth of pavement, and then on the flip side, on the east side, you have 36 feet of pavement. So what that tells you is throughout the whole corridor, there is no continuity as it pertains to the actual street itself. In addition to that, one of the things I want to highlight is right of way. And that too varies significantly throughout this corridor and also does have quite an influence on the alternatives that are putting forward. So just to highlight on the west end, where it's your most narrow, and that's near Sycamore and Taft. If you are familiar with that location, it's incredibly narrow, and it's approximately 30 feet of right-of-way. Now, if you continue on along the corridor, the right-of-way now changes midpoint about 50 to 55, and then just west of Woody Drive, we're looking at 90 feet of right-of-way. So as you can imagine, we really do have this no continuity right of way nor pavement width along this whole corridor, and so that does add some challenges. Some other factors that we considered as must have based off of what we heard from the public comment, besides just taking into account what available right of way we have, we also needed to take into account continuous bike and ped facilities. And what does that look like? On-street parking where possible. We did hear from several of the property owners along that corridor, and we actually have gone out and witnessed this corridor. Adjacent property owners do use it for parking, either, people coming to visit the houses or their own cars themselves out on the street. Nonetheless, this is a neighborhood street, and so we needed to take that into account. So parking was important. In addition to that, we wanted to ensure that we had that 6-foot continuous sidewalk through the whole corridor. With that being said, I'm going to jump into the alternatives. And as I walk through each alternative, at the end of each alternative, once I discuss it, I'm going to ask you a series of questions again. Same scenarios we did when we kicked off. So starting off, alternative one. Alternative one is bike lanes and sidewalks with on-street parking on both sides. This is one of our largest footprints. So remember, if you recall, we have got the pavement width, but then we also have right-of-way. And so I'm going to show you that here in a second, what that looks like. So what you have is your current beautiful street as it is. It's a residential, in this case, a residential, and it really does look like have a very rural feel to it. With the installation of 6-foot sidewalks on both sides, on-street parking in some locations, 5-foot bike lanes on both sides, and bulb outs and 10-foot travel lanes, this is what that visual looks like. You'll see it here. And I'll talk about, just really quick, take a moment to talk about what this is. Bulb outs is the way in which we actually make a treatment. It's an installation of concrete that bulbs out into the street. And really what that is to pretty much provide what we call friction. So if vehicles are speeding through this area, one of the things that we want to do is create some friction. And while you recognize the wider the street is, the faster cars go because it just is a thoroughfare, we want to narrow things up. And so the installation of bulb outs is a traffic calming tool that we can use. So you're going to see that in all three alternatives. That is an treatment that we are suggesting. In addition to that, you see on-street bike facilities, and you see parking on both sides, and then you have the sidewalks. So what does that look like? Sycamore to Plum, that is the narrowest area through this whole corridor. You've got the sidewalks, bike lanes, the 10-foot travel lanes. And then the area which gets a little bit larger, you have the 6-foot sidewalks, 7.5-foot bike lanes, 10-foot travel lanes, and again, reflective on the other side. The difference between this segment, Sycamore to Plum, is you're going to see there's no parking, and it's because it's so narrow. And in this case, from Plum to 36, you're going to see the parking. Right now, in that narrow segment along Taft Street, there is no parking. So that does continue with all three alternatives. So what does it look like from an aerial? So Sycamore is over here to the left side. Something I want to highlight that is reflective on all three alternatives is we have changed the radius of the sidewalk here. Currently, if you're coming up Sycamore, and what we've understood from several of the property owners along this corridor, folks will drive up here, they'll quickly take this turn and they'll continue, and they're actually going at high rate of speeds. We've also heard of several people ending up into the irrigation ditch on the north side. We are going to narrow this space up on all three alternatives, and that is to be able to, like I mentioned, create that friction to slow people down. This is a segment where there is no parking. and it's because it's already narrow. But what you're also going to notice is there's what we call a chicane, and a chicane is an opportunity to create additional traffic calming. So right now, it's a straight shot through to the rest of Taft. Well, what we've done is we've actually call it like a kink in the road, and it's really, again, to cause a little bit more friction to force people to slow down. So continuing along, east on Taft, you're going to see that we start the installation of the parking, and the parking there is reflected there in yellow, and then you've got the bike lanes. Something else I want to draw your attention to, because it's incredibly important as you look to all three of these alternatives, because there is property impact on two of these, and then one of them actually is the narrowest option. The property line is what's here dotted in blue. So just as you're looking to these alternatives, just pay close attention to the fact that there is, in some cases, some property impacts. Continue along to the east side, and you're going to see, like I mentioned, the installation of those bulb outs and that four-way stop right there with the crosswalk, designated crosswalks. And then the last segment right here, as we get closer to 36th Street, we continue the same cross sections where we've got the parking, the bike lanes, all the way up until 36. One of the things to note is both in 36 as well, more particular in 36, but also in Sycamore, those intersections we will be looking to, one, not only ADA enhancements, but in addition, how we're going to connect to existing conditions, how we're going to connect to the existing bike lanes. That will be reflected in the final rendering. In addition to that, highlights about curb ramps and such, those two will be reflected in the final iterations that we put forward. So with that being said, that concludes the introduction of alternative one. So I'd like to go back to the poll. So I'll toddle over here. This is going to be one additional poll that we're going to ask. There's a series of questions. What features of alternative one do you like? Is it the designated bike lanes, the on-street parking on both sides, the bulb outs, the narrow travel lanes, the sidewalks? Go ahead and click on there and let us know what your preference is. All right, the results seem to be coming in. So several of you guys had highlighted bulb outs as of strong interest. Sidewalks, so continuous sidewalks throughout the corridor seems to be the front runner here, which goes back to the original intent of the project, certainly was to be able to look at this for bike and pedestrian enhancements, because currently right now, kids who are walking to the school there and such, they don't necessarily have complete sidewalks to walk on. And so what are the driving forces behind this project? Designated bike lanes, bulb outs, narrow travel lanes, but it looks as though sidewalks certainly is the front runner. All right, with that being said, I've got one more question. What concerns about alternative one do you have? Give that a moment to populate. You've got property impacts. I'd like to see more protection for the bicyclists, narrow sidewalks, or narrow travel lanes. So go ahead and click on the one that is of most interest to you, whatever one highlights the concern you may have about this alternative. Okay, looks as though narrow travel lanes is the front runner here. Oh, I'm sorry, property impacts at 57%. Certainly, as I highlighted, and what I'd encourage you to do is certainly go look at the alternatives we're putting forward so you see where those property lines are. But property impacts, they're at 60%, and narrow travel lanes. So both of those are being the concerns that you guys have. All right, with that being said, we're going to jump into alternative two. So I'll take a moment to toggle back over to our story map. So alternative two, sidewalks and multi-use pathway with on-street parking on the north side. Alternative two includes two travel lanes, on-street parking, and detached multi-use pathway. Something to note on this, it's 7-foot sidewalks on the north side, on-street parking in some locations, bulb outs do restrict where we could put on-street parking, and 10-foot detached multi-use pathway on the south side. So this is what your beautiful street looks like right now. And then the installation of a multi-use pathway, which you'll see right here on the south side. And you see that there's a buffer included. And then you see parking on the north side, and then you see that continuous sidewalk. And again, parking is reflected in all of these alternatives, and primarily it's because we do recognize that this is a neighborhood street, and thus folks still need to be able to park out in front of their homes. So taking a look at the most narrowest segment along this, alternative two, Sycamore to Plum, you've got 7-foot sidewalks, travel lanes, multi-use pathway. What you're not going to notice here is because this segment is so narrow, there is no buffer. So you've got the multi-use pathway. And I do want to highlight both the multi-use pathway, the bike lanes, the sharrows that we are going to be showcasing here. We have does meet our level of traffic stress for cyclists. And so to speak to that just briefly while I have that moment, we look to all of our alternatives that we're putting forward, all of our bike facility treatment options, and we try to do an analysis as a level of comfort for all users, and we want to achieve a 1 or 2. In this case, because of the installation of traffic calming elements on all 3 alternatives, as well as a multi-use pathway and the speeds and the volumes, we're confident all 3 options putting forward do provide for a level of comfort for users to be able to comfortably navigate this space. However, that is subjective, right? What may be comfortable for you if you're a commuter cyclist as opposed to somebody who's just trying to navigate with their family down the street is certainly different. But these 3 alternatives we're confident enough does the job. So moving on from this narrowest segment on Sycamore to Plum, let's jump into Plum to 36. This is the largest segment along the corridor. And as I mentioned, it's a different personality, different widths, pavement widths, different right-of-way, and thus why we see these 2 different options. So you've got the sidewalks, the parking, 10-foot travel lanes. This is where you now see the installation of that buffer and that multi-use pathway. So what does that look like from above? So again, this is that narrow segment right off of Sycamore. Same thing as I highlighted before. We're narrowing up this radius, turn radius, so that way we can slow cars coming into this location. In our final rendering, we will showcase some enhancements to this location as well as 36. So you've got the multi-use pathway there on the south side. You've got the complete sidewalk there on the north side. And this is where about Plum Street is where you start seeing that parking available. And it continues all the way through. Again, I want to highlight that blue line along this corridor is the property line. So close attention to what that looks like as you look to these alternatives. Continuous along, then you've got Tamarack where you've got that 4-way stop. Again, those bulb outs, and that's to help facilitate, narrow up that space, make it more comfortable for pedestrians. We recognize this is a walk to school route, so important to be able to provide for that connection. Continue along to the next segment, and this is where we get wide. It gets a little bit wider. And something I want to highlight, you've got that parking, you've got that multi-use pathway. And I want to take a moment here because I just realized I forgot to talk about this on the first alternative. So I'm going to speak to it now, but this applies to all 3 alternatives. In this location between Arthur Street and Woody Drive, currently, if you're familiar with the street, it's incredibly wide. You'll see right here is where you'll see that car part. So it's an incredibly wide space. And as a result, this happens to be the location where people are speeding quite well. What we've heard from the property owners, they're speeding through this location. And it's because of the width. I mean, at this location, I think we're looking at 50 feet. And so that is quite, yeah. So we're looking at this 36 feet at those widest point. And so what we've done on all 3 alternatives is we've actually narrowed this. And so you're going to see we've built out into the road at this location. And partly it's because, again, it's creating that chicane, it's creating a traffic calming element and applying it here. And so you're going to see that this road does narrow. And partly it's because we're wanting to create that friction to slow cars down. Continue along this treatment, that multi-use pathway, and you see that buffer. We continue it all the way to 36th Street. And again, in the final rendering, based off the alternative we choose, we will ensure that we take into account how this multi-use pathway, if this were the alternative, how this multi-use pathway will connect to the existing bike lanes that are on 36th Street. In addition, we'll see enhancements to this for ADA compliance throughout the whole corridor. It's just not reflected on this rendering. It will be reflected on the final one. With that being said, that concludes my introduction to concept 2. Toggle back to our platform, and we're going to ask again the same questions that we did on the previous. Okay, what features of alternative 2 do you like? Multi-use pathway on the south side, sidewalk on the north side, on-street parking on the north side, bulb outs, or narrow travel lanes? Give me a moment to. Okay, let's see what they start. Sidewalks on the north side seems to be the front runner at 42%. On-street parking is important. Narrow travel lanes is a lot of folks appreciate that. And then, of course, bulb outs there is tied up there with the sidewalks on the north side. Let's give it a few moments while people finish up their inquiries? All right, fabulous. So the front runner here looks to be the sidewalks on the north side, the narrow travel lanes. Bulb outs is somewhere there in the third, including the multi-use pathway on the south side. So we have one more question, and it's actually the alternative of that is, what do you not like? What would you see? What are some of your concerns about alternative two? Is it the lack of on-street bike lanes, lack of on-street parking, property impacts, or narrow travel lanes? Give you a moment to respond. So we see lack of on-street bike lanes is the front runner here, lack of on-street parking on the south side, property impacts. Give it a moment. All right, property impact seems to be the front runner here. A lot of people concerned about the impact to the properties. The lack of on-street bike lanes, certainly, and the narrow travel lanes is still up there at the top. So fabulous. All right, with that being said, it concludes our second alternative. I'm going to jump over here and toggle to our third for the evening. See, so what you've got here is alternative three, sidewalks and sharrows with on-street parking on both sides, 7-foot sidewalks on both sides, on-street parking in some locations on both sides, bulb outs, and 10-foot travel lanes. So this is what your beautiful street looks like today. And this has the potential of what it could look like in the future. So I want to just speak really briefly to what these sharrows are. So sharrows are this is on-street bike facilities that you're sharing the space with vehicles. So while we recognize that different users and comfort levels of cyclists really make a determination of if you're going to use a space or not, with the installation of bulb outs, the speeds being at 25 miles per hour and the volumes being low, this still does meet our LTS guidelines that were adopted by the Commission. However, again, comfort is subjective based off of those who use this space. So is it comfortable for a mother who's taking their children somewhere? That's certainly up to them to make that decision if they're going to stay in the road itself or they're going to use the adjacent sidewalks. While we recognize in this, it's continuous sidewalks through the whole corridor. The bicyclists share that space with the travel lanes, but it also does have parking on both sides. All the elements from additional parking as well as the bulb outs do provide traffic calming, and so thus it does make it that sharrows are an appropriate alternative to put forward. I do want to highlight that this is the smallest footprint that we have available for choice this evening, being that the property impacts, and you'll see here, are significantly less. So what does this look like throughout the whole corridor? So let's take a peek at that narrow segment. This is Sycamore to Plum. So it's sidewalks, 10-foot travel lanes, and then you've got the sidewalks. Again, that shared space. And in essence, this is ultimately what's happening currently right now, just because there are no bike facilities along this corridor. Moving along to the area which we see a little bit more of width, 7-foot sidewalks, you've got parking on both sides, travel lanes, and then you've got the sidewalks again. And again, the cyclists are sharing the space with the drivers. Moving along to give us a view from the air. So you've got Sycamore as all three alternatives that we've tightened up this turn right here to slow people down. In addition to that, you're going to see there's the sharrow, and you're going to see, and I want you guys to pay attention, that property line. So that property line there is in blue. So this is the smallest footprint we have as an alternative option. Again, this is where parking will start with all three alternatives, which is at West Plum Street, and that's because this so happens to be the area that starts to get a little bit wider. Continue along the corridor, you get to Tamarack where you see that four-way stop, and then you will see it designated, and then continue along. And let's take a peek at the other side. And then we get to Taft Sycamore to 36th Street, that narrow space, the additional bulb outs. This location where we've narrowed it, as I mentioned, this is on all three alternatives. Continue along all the way to 36th Street. All three of these options are available to review in more depth on our website. And so I want to encourage you, if you want to come take a peek, you can come back up here to the story map that's available on our website. 1, 2, and 3 gives you a chance to kind of peruse it at a slower pace. With that being said, that does conclude the introduction of our third alternative. I'll toggle back over to our platform, ask again the two questions that are important. One, let's start with, what did you like about alternative 3? Is it minimal property impacts, narrow travel lanes, bulb outs, shared bike and vehicle travel lanes, sidewalks, cruise this a little bit down, and on-street parking on both sides? So I'll give you a moment to respond. All right, looking at the responses that are coming in, we're seeing that several people like it because it has minimal property impacts. It's got sidewalks, that'd certainly be a front runner. On-street parking on both sides. Narrow travel lanes and bulb outs. And so that gives us, I think that concludes the respondents for this one particular question. I did just see Denny, who highlighted minimal property impacts, certainly is a reason in which you appreciate this one. All right, well, let's take a look at the second question. So if we can get the second poll that's up here. What concerns about alternative 3 do you have? Lack of designated bike facilities, property impacts, or narrow travel lanes? Give you a moment to respond. We've got designated bike facilities. The lack thereof has you concerned. Narrow travel lanes has you concerned. Give it a moment. So designated bike facilities, lack thereof seems to be the front runner concern with this alternative, with 70% of you guys coming in. Okay. Because I think I had one more person I'm waiting on. All right. Well, again, front runner is the lack of designated bike facilities is the biggest concern. With that, I just want to toggle back over to the landing page itself and talk about a few additional things. So our project schedule, just to give you a highlight, we came to you in December, this past December, and it was a survey. It's like we asked you, please come discuss what is important to you along your corridor as a neighborhood, what's important that you want to see. This past spring, we did a lot of the data gathering, went and did some of the light survey observations to get a general idea of one, parking usage, but in addition to that, property impacts. We are at summer of 2022, and this is where we're seeking your input and your participation. While we have 3 alternatives we're putting forward, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have picked which alternative we want the commission to approve. Alternative 1, 2, and 3, it's going to be important for you guys to help us make a determination which of those 3 is your preference. While we recognize your attendance today is one subset of the population, we do ask and have engaged with property owners along the corridor. Certainly their input is important as they reside there, but also we want to ensure the other community members who use this corridor can participate. So while we appreciate you being here tonight, we want to encourage, if you have friends or family, to log online, or people who use this space, log online, participate, fill out the survey, the general comment survey up here in the right hand, where it says general comment survey. They can fill that out for one more week. Once we conclude from this public comment period, we will be looking to all 3 of those alternatives to bring one of them to the commission for approval. Well, this is not the last time you guys have an opportunity to participate and engage. When we take it forward to the commission, that is an additional opportunity for you to come out and speak directly to the commissioners, as they are the ones who make the final decision whether or not one of these alternatives moves forward. In construction schedule, we're certainly out currently. Construction schedule is currently planned for 2026, and that is if we have an alternative that is adopted from the commission. With that being said, I do just want to highlight some of my contact information. I am going to go back to our platform here and open it up for more dialogue. But before I do so, I do want to highlight how you can get in touch with me personally. So projects at achdIdaho.org, and my phone number is listed 208-387-6318. Either one of those is the best way in which to get in touch with me. If you feel like you have additional insight, or if you have additional concerns you'd like to share, I certainly would love to speak with you about those. Certainly, if you reside along the street and you have some concerns, I certainly would appreciate an opportunity to speak with you as well. Your participation, as I mentioned, is incredibly important, because as a project team, we're going to take your survey results, your participation, and that's going to help us give us direction on what our next steps look like. So this whole landing page is available on our website. It'll be available in a link that we're going to put there in the Q&A segment. Certainly, it's open for one more week. Encourage yourself, friends and family and neighbors to log on there, fill it out, because we're going to need your direction to help us move this project forward. With that being said, I do want to toggle back to the end. We have one last question in which to ask. And now that you've seen all 3 of the alternatives, which alternative do you prefer? Alternative 1, bike lanes and sidewalks with on-street parking on both sides. Alternative 2, sidewalks and multi-use pathway with on-street parking on the north side. Alternative 3, sidewalks and shares with on-street parking on both sides. Or none of the alternatives. Let's give it a second. So it looks as though we have a tie. Let's give it a moment for all of you. So it's like alternative 3, sidewalks and sharrows, on-street parking on both sides seems to be the front runner with 44%. And then followed shortly thereafter by bike lanes and sidewalks and on-street parking on both sides at 33%. And then, of course, we did have somebody who, a couple people who picked alternative 2 and those who would prefer none of the alternatives themselves. So that concludes the question segment of the presentation and the introduction of the alternatives themselves. I'm going to flip over to the Q&A and see if there's any outstanding questions that need to be answered. Where do they all go? Let's see. I think we had some questions.
Brooke, all of the questions are in the chat
Yep, I
section.
see that right here. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to just toggle through, see if there's anything that's outstanding. Katie, did you consider adding bulb outs at Sycamore and Taft as well? Good question. So both the Sycamore and Taft intersection, as well as the 36 intersection, we will be looking to those two for enhancements in our final rendering. That intersection there is Sycamore and Taft. We recognize that it's actually a pretty used intersection itself, and currently a lot of people speed through that segment. We will be looking to enhancements at that location, one to help facilitate people crossing it. Bulb outs could be an option. If we put bulb outs there on Taft, so if you're turning off of Sycamore onto Taft in its current configuration, would be too narrow. And partly it's because if it's too narrow, you guys won't be able to navigate through it. So right now there aren't bulb outs at that location, but certainly if we're looking for Sycamore, we're going to look to enhance that crossing and make it more comfortable for folks. So let's moving along. I'm not able to participate with the questions. Denise, thank you for that. If you could go to the story map online, the questions are there as well. And so I want to encourage you to go click over there, log online. If you haven't participated in the survey, you can participate in the survey. Those same questions are the same ones you guys had tonight. Again, some of your pop-up blockers might be preventing these from participating. And so that is another place in which you can participate. Oh, I guess, Kristen, we did not consider, and partly it's because it's too narrow. So let's see, how does irrigation ditch play into this? Would it be covered by the sidewalks and pathways? Natalie, that's a good question. The irrigation ditch, depending on which alternative we put forward, there is a likelihood that it would be impacted in all 3 alternatives. We will work with the irrigation district to find out what that's going to look like in any type of specific design elements that need to be taken into account. So as of right now, if 2 of the alternatives were put forward, certainly there would be irrigation ditch impacts, likely a tile, in other words, covering it up and putting a tile in. Let's see, multi-use pathway seems to create bike ped conflicts and it seems to have risk at each intersections for bikes. Certainly we have to take into account the crossings at intersections for multi-use pathways. They are fairly wide with a buffer, so 10 feet with a 3-foot buffer, so about 13 feet for folks. Similar to what the Greenbelt used to be, if you were to navigate along the Greenbelt in some segments, that was the standard width at one point, certainly has grown over time. David, any thoughts on what the multi-use pathway buffer surface treatment would be? What right now we look to the city of Boise because of that buffer space would become their responsibility for maintenance. Oftentimes it's stamped concrete. It's not gravel from, as an alternative or grass. It is very narrow. However, stamped concrete seems to be the standard treatment we put in place. However, that's a design element that can be further discussed in the future. So any thoughts on what multi-use buffer treatment would be? Okay. Some of these have already been answered, so Gary. Thank you, Gary. Yep, project design. So as a cyclist for number 2, I would ride in the traffic lane, certainly. And, number 2 being the multi-use pathway, we recognize that a multi-use pathway, while it's not for your commuter cyclists, oftentimes commuter cyclists are more comfortable taking the travel lane. One of the things that's incredibly important to ACHD is to find a treatment that is for all users. So while we recognize that there's those strong, confident cyclists that navigate through our streets on a daily basis, when we look to build treatment options, we look to build for the 8 to 80. It's the mom carrying their children to school, or in this case, kids who are walking to Taft Elementary School. So multi-use pathway in those situations is a fabulous alternative, but we recognize for commuter cyclists or those who cycle often, it's not very appealing. Are these renderings to scale, showing accurate images of the yards? The property lines are accurate images that are reflected there. So while you were going through each alternative, I want to encourage you guys to take a good look at those property lines. We did not do a level of survey work, so there is some, take that into account. We did not do a final survey on this, so that property line isn't really clear in some cases, but just be aware that that property line that we have there is what we pulled off on our GIS. Could you link to traffic counts? Certainly, I see that we're addressing that. Average passenger trucks just over 6 feet. How do 2 trucks get through in a 10-foot? 10-foot travel lanes is narrow. We recognize, and partly it's because that traffic calming piece that we want to add in. So we do recognize the 10-foot travel lanes is applied in several of our residential streets as it is of today. And we certainly recognize while it's narrow, vehicles are able to navigate through that space. Fire truck access, considering bulb outs. City of Boise is at on the project team, so any concerns with access for fire is taken into account. Notice that no crosswalk locations are identified. On Tamarack, that is an existing crosswalk, and we did enhance it to paint that into place, but that is the only location along this corridor. But it doesn't mean that every intersection is a legal crossing. And so that is why the bulb outs are oftentimes put in those places to help facilitate people to comfortably get across. We'll be planning to improve visibility. Jeffrey, thank you for your comment regarding visibility. That's a design piece. Certainly, it is our goal to ensure that you can be able to see throughout this whole corridor. Are there other traffic calming measures being considered? So this has come up quite a bit regarding speed bumps. Josh, to your point, so the traffic calming, both the chicanes that we put on, on both sides where we've applied them and we've narrowed up the road, in addition to bulb outs, are significant traffic calming elements. The problem with speed bumps along a corridor, and I'll look to Kendall if he happens to have a number in the back of his head, for us to achieve traffic calming just with speed bumps alone requires a significant number of installation. In addition to that, property owners who are adjacent to those speed bumps, while it slows vehicles down, if you happen to be the property owner next to that speed bump, you will hear trailers oftentimes coming through that. And so while we look to traffic calming opportunities, speed bumps is a standard practice and we have put them in several locations, but in locations such as this where we have an opportunity to do other type of traffic calming measures, it's always a front runner and a preference for those who reside along the street. Kendall, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and Brooke, I mean, one thing too is, the type of road too kind of weighs into this. Yeah, speed humps for this type of road because of the, we've got fire emergency services concerns we have to address. Kind of like you said, we are looking more at some other type of features to kind of achieve some of the traffic calming with this type of roadway.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. We try to, while speed bumps are applied in some locations, if we have a chance not to use speed bumps and to try other types of elements, we will. So, and it looks as though several of these other questions from Josh and Jeffrey did get answered. All right, with that being said, I don't see any additional questions that are there in the chat. Oh, there is. Thank you both. Josh, you're welcome. David, with Taft being planned a bike route and with frequent bicyclist use, I'm not in support of the shared lanes. Thank you, David, for your feedback. And that's why your guys' participation is incredibly important. The reality is again, the type of treatment options available for folks to navigate through this space, for comfort level, it's a little bit different, and we recognize that. All three options, we are comfortable and confident that they do meet our level of traffic stress, which our commission adopted. However, it goes back to that, what is comfortable for you and what is comfortable for a mother as opposed to a commuter cyclist, certainly different, or for a little child who's walking to the Taft Elementary School, that's certainly different. So with that concludes our presentation, unless there's any verbal questions. I think several of you guys were great at using the chat, and I don't see any hand raised. All right, with that being said, this does conclude our presentation for this evening. I appreciate all of your participation. Most importantly, I want to encourage you to continue to participate. The survey is going to be open for 1 more week. So your neighbors, your friends, your family who use the space, we want to encourage them to get out and participate and answer that survey. As I mentioned, we do not have a front runner as it pertains to which alternative as a team we're putting forward. Our team members are made up of ACHD staff, a staff engineer, as well as our bike and ped coordinator, as well as a planner is on this team. In addition to that, we have the city of Boise. And so a lot of the coordination efforts in particular, say for instance, the fire conversation about access, all of those conversations are happening because those are important elements that we have to take into account anytime in which we're looking to a street. We also want to emphasize that this is a neighborhood street. And so several of you which reside along the street, it's important that you participate and you encourage your neighbors to participate. While we recognize we're building out our community with the street enhancement, we also know people reside along the street and it's important to them. And we want to ensure that we hear your voice. So with that being said, if you haven't participated in the survey, in addition to the evening's comments, you certainly can go online and do that. If you need to get in touch with me, my contact information, I'll toggle once more over. You can get in touch with me at projects@achd.org or at that phone number. If you have any additional concerns, questions, I'm certainly available to answer them. We have a long ways to go before this is put forward for an adoption. So if you have not provided us your email, I want to encourage you to email me so we can ensure that we keep you up to date on our progress. We anticipate taking this to the commission for adoption either in the month of September or October, depending on commission availability, which that being said, the final option that we put forward, we will inform you via email, as well as you'll get correspondence updates about this project if you signed up for it. So please give us your email and your contact information. We'll tell you when we're going in front of the commission. It'll come forward. There'll be a public hearing, so you have a chance to come and testify. The ultimate decision rests upon the commissioners, and so they're the ones who are going to decide whether or not which alternative moves forward. So with that being said, the link to the story map is listed up there in your chat box. And I certainly, if there's any questions, I don't see any questions, no hands raised. Thank you guys for your participation this evening. Have a safe 4th of July. Is there a general timeline for commission decision? So how this works is if we take this, say, for instance, we take this project to commission in the month of September, the final project and the draft plan will come out in early September, so either the 1st or 2nd week. It'll be presented to the commission at a work session. So I will take this project to a work session, present it to them. The following day, it opens up for public comment. So again, that's one more opportunity for you guys to engage with us. All of your comments that you provide, either through the project's email on the link or comments in which you specifically send to the commissioners, they will see them. Any comments that are received at the public comment period following the day that we release the final alternative, the commissioners also receive that. And then 2 weeks later, I go in front of the commission, I present the alternative, a preferred alternative that the staff is recommending, and they make the ultimate decision. So it's about a 2-week process. It'll usually start, and it depends on scheduling. If we go for the end of September or the end of October, it just depends on their available schedule. So with that being said, I think I've answered all the questions pertaining to timelines, commission adoptions. All right, thank you, David. Okay, all right. Well, certainly I want to encourage you to reach out to me if you guys have any questions. It's a privilege to be before you this evening. Certainly welcome any feedback or comments that you may have. Again, encourage your neighbors and your friends and family who use this space to participate. And enjoy your guys' 4th of July. Thank you.